try to not. oh, I'll also try not to boom my voice, which of course is unusual again from working in a busy youth zone, used to having to project one's voice. But yeah, thank you for inviting me. Really pleased to be joining you, and really conscious I'm joining you at the tail end of the day, and I'm joining you virtually. So I haven't had the kind of grounding in the conversations of the day, but wanted to specifically think about young people and youth voice, and that's what I've been invited just to maybe share some reflections on, and then join you in some Q&A. So as I understand it, the Cumbria Climate Assembly is particularly thinking about who gets the opportunity to be heard and influence decision makers around climate change and climate-based decisions in Cumbria. And of course, we would advocate really strongly not just about the community voices being heard, but also how are young people specifically being heard. And that's really important because when we think about access to decision makers, whether that be, I think you've identified local councils, business communities, of course, young people often aren't in the workforce already, or if they are, they're often in precarious contracts or low paid work. So their opportunity to influence maybe decision makers through that forum isn't available. Young people are often below, well, they are below the voting age in a general sense. I know that's changing for some of the kind of more regional votes. So they don't always have necessarily that opportunity to express their democratic view and voice in those kind of more formal forums. And they often have less access to decision makers. Today's a prime example. We've got young people who have turned up today from 11 till 4 as youth co-researchers thinking about how they want to be heard within their local community. And we've invited a raft of decision makers into the youth zone, but not many of them work routinely on a Saturday, and so haven't have chosen not to join us. So their access to be heard is often less, let alone then who is listening. And of course, it really matters, particularly around climate change and the climate emergency. Obviously, we all are a part of a global community where the kind of impacts and the consequences of climate change are becoming increasingly alarming. But of course, young people will bear the impacts of what's happening now and the decisions that are being made now well into their future. And increasingly young people are uprising and actually demanding place and space to be heard. And why does it matter? So a couple of examples that I wanted to just highlight that have come up just in kind of my own radar this week. There was one example where a community planning team were thinking about how they could increase access to a local play park to children and young people. And the focus of those decisions was really around play equipment and the design of the play park. But they actually happily put some questions out to young people and said, how, what would support you to be able to enjoy this play park more? And their responses were benches for my parents to sit on, so they would allow us to play for longer in this space. Shelters for our parents to gather within, so they weren't as uncomfortable when they're waiting for us to play, which was completely different to what the adult decision makers were expecting and they themselves kind of plotting. And it's a really kind of tangible example of why it matters. The other example here today, like I said, we've got some youth co-researchers gathered here at the Youth Zone because their local community patch have identified children and young people as one of their priorities, full stop. There hadn't, up until today, been any kind of engagement or thought around, and beyond that, again, they're pleased to see children and young people named as a priority. Beyond that, there hadn't previously been a plan to then actually engage with children and young people about what should be in that community plan. And I can tell you just from listening and being around young people today, they're up for contributing, and their ideas are already challenging and disrupting some of the stuff that's being put forward for them rather than with them. And I want to invite us all to think about how with this question, how do we change this? How do we think about getting more voices heard? And from my time working with UNICEF UK, I would really like to propose that we anchor some of our way forward in a children's rights lens, because children have a right to be heard. And I think that framing is essential when we're in these forums and thinking about how to increase the opportunities for young people to have a stake and have a direct say. All too often, young people are asked to be grateful and asked to be thankful to the adults for allowing them a place around the table or a space on the agenda to be heard. And if we flip that and think of young people as rights holders and adults as duty bearers, actually the responsibility is on the adults in the room and in the space to ensure that young people have all opportunities that they have to be heard. And the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child is a fantastic frame for that. There's a specific article, Article 12, which is about their right to be heard. And that recognises that young people, and actually the UNCRC was convened because of a recognition that young people are citizens in their own right. And so we need to sort of acknowledge their place in our society. And along with their evolving capacities, create appropriate opportunities for them to realise their rights, including as stakeholders in our society and our communities. So I would really encourage us to think about children's rights in a rights-based lens. And less seeking permission and more fulfilling and upholding rights. Because ultimately, young people have a right to protection, a right to health, and a right to welfare. And of course, that is completely interwoven with the climate crisis and climate change and action to it. There's a really fantastic paper, and this is the kind of thread of this assembly I know is about voice and being heard. But there's a fantastic paper that challenges us, and actually it was written in 2007, and the paper's titled Voice Isn't Enough. And it was written by Professor Laura Lundy, who is a professor of children's rights. And she wrote this paper. Oops, sorry, the phone's ringing. She wrote this paper acknowledging that voice often, we gather voice, young people are often invited to give their voice, but without audience and without influence, what's the value of voice? So Laura has coined a model of participation called the Lundy model, and it asks us to think about youth engagement and youth participation through four interconnected frames, and that is voice, and that is important, but it also then adds in space, creating safe spaces and opportunities for young people to express that voice and be heard. Today's a prime example. The space is here, but people aren't joining young people in that space. But the other two domains are audience and influence. And that's about who's listening and what are they going to do about it. And I would suggest it's a really powerful frame to work with young people, but also as a kind of collective. And I think it's just as relevant for adult groupings, actually, as it is for children and young people. And it allows us to say, when we're invited into spaces, to have a voice, to say, actually, my question, first of all, is who's listening and what they're going to do about it, and starts to actually demand some of that kind of response as opposed to seek permission for it. That framing has then been realised. I know you're looking for recommendations and you're looking for solutions as an assembly, and I can propose again or reference two mechanisms through which that kind of principle or that concept is starting to be realised. So UNICEF UK have developed what's called a child rights impact assessment, and it's designed for all decision makers, often across public services, to complete or to certainly reference when they're making decisions, and challenges them to assess those decisions against a child's rights impact assessment. So how have young people been heard and considered, and those views been considered in the decisions that they're making? And there is also a Lundy model checklist, which asks again decision makers to consider space, voice, audience, and influence, and again really challenge themselves about have the four domains been considered as part of the planning, delivery, and then the feedback loop of decision makings. So there is an increasing kind of tangible range of tools that we can provide to people and advocate for their use, which I think would start to influence and change decision makers. But the kind of anchor in all of this is about orientating that in a child rights frame. And that would be my kind of key primary message for today. So I think that's about 10 minutes. So I'll pause because I know we then want to go into Q&A.